Welcome back to the SSAS and MDX training sessions, class 9, I guess. So in last session, we discussed about prior to caching, and we discussed about the storage modes. And if I remember it correctly, we enabled prior to caching for one of the dimension, I think as customer. And let's see, I added a couple of records into the database table yesterday after the session was over. For example, if I go to White World Importers DW database, and if I query dimension table customer, you see there are a couple of records I entered at the end where it's not specified, not applicable, not duplicable, whatever it is. So I entered these three records, and I have not processed the cube after that. And if I go to the cube, or if I go to the dimension customer, if I browse it, and if I go to the customer name, and you should be able to see the newly added entries here. So I set the slice interval to 10 seconds, silence interval to 10 seconds, and override interval to 10 minutes. So now if you see, the records are coming even without processing. And if you want to see another example, we can quickly insert one more record into this table. Insert into this table values, and I'll say it's 406. I'm just giving incremental order, and 605, comma, I'll give let's say not applicable text. One more, and postal code, let's say 99999, and valid from is get date. So it will take the current date, whatever it is. And I think the next field is valid too. It is again get date, and lineage key I'll set it to 2. So I insert one more record. Now if I go to bill to customer or customer, I don't see the data, right? And let's wait for 10 seconds and see whether the prior to caching will pull the record into your cube without processing the cube. Now let me quickly refresh and see, and you see the record is in. So you don't need, see, there is small chunks of data that is getting added to your data warehouse. And if you want to get that data cached in order to give near real time to the MOLAP storage mode, in that case, it's a good option to go ahead with prior to caching. So all the data will be cached, and this data will be written when you query using MDX. The data will be queried from the analysis service storage as well as the cache, and returns the result set. In this case, if you see, I inserted a record. Within 10 seconds, it's added to the dimension. And similarly, if you go for a bill to customer, you will see that in the field that we have, the value that we have entered. Similarly, buying group, you see that NA. So this is a beautiful option. This is how you can make use of prior to caching, the same way you can make use of prior to caching in your fact data. Now, let's go to the next concept, the most important one in analysis services, that is processing. So now you know what is processing, what will happen when you process. As we discussed in our earlier sessions, when you select process from your data warehouse, and remember, when you select process and when you select MOLAP storage mode, then it will read the data from here to your analysis server, and then it will create aggregations and indexes for the data. So first job is data reading. Second job is creating indexes, creating aggregations and indexes on top of the data and the aggregations. So for all these, the key is process. When you select process, it will trigger. If it is a roll-up storage mode, as you all know, it will leave the data here as is. It will just create the indexes, and it will try to create the aggregations. Now, let's see different types of processing we have. Before going to that, what all objects in analysis services that we can process? So if you take analysis services, you can process dimensions. So dimensions has this option of processing, and the whole database, you can process the whole database level, or you can process a cube, or you can process a single partition. So these are the different objects which you can process using the processing wizard. And the first one is dimensions, and at every different object you will see different options to process. So when I say different options to process, there are multiple ways that you can, multiple processing methods that you can use to process the data. Now let's see in detail. So let me erase the drawings. And when I say database level, on the database side, on the database here, if you see SSAS training, when you right click and select process, this is, we call it the database level. And when you select it, it will give you some options, processing options, which you can pick depending on the requirement. So first, let the project solution deploy to the server. It is deployed. Now it opened the processing window. If you see here processing options, it has three processing options. One is process default, another one is process full, and the third one is process clear. When you do process by selecting any option from here, when you do process at the database level, it will try to process all the objects that are available in the system. That is applied when you do at the database level, that is applied on the all the dimensions. Let's say if I click on process full, then it will go on process all the dimensions, all the cubes, and all the partitions in the cubes. Okay, now let's go to um, employee dimension. So here you can process. When you select process, you see different set of options. Default was there, full was there at the database level, clear was there, but data index and update was not there. So you see three new processing options at the dimension level. Actually, there are four new. One more option is there, but that is hidden here. I'll show you that. We will discuss about the processing option, process add to. Now the third option is, the third object which you can go on, which you can process it, the cube. If you process here, the processing window shows almost all the objects except a new thing, process structure, and you don't find the process update here. We will see why you not have the process update, and you see a new one called process add. And similarly, if you go to the partitions, you can use the processing button, processing option, and you'll have the same set of options what you have at the cube level. Now, overall, if you see, there are 7 to 8 different kinds of processing options. We will see one by one. First, let's start with, but remember, process full, if it is at the partition level or cube level or dimension level or at the database level, it will do the same job. It has the same functionality. Similarly, process data, wherever you see process data, it's gonna do the same job. And process default, it's gonna do the same job. So let's start with the database level and try to cover each and every processing option that is available in analysis services. So when I say process at the database level, I see three options. The first option is process default. When you select process default, um, analysis services will check for all the objects that are available in the database. Okay, and it will try to bring all the objects processing status to process. So now let's say a new dimension is added. The process is processed will be false for that. Now when you do process default, it will go and pick the current status of each object, and it will apply the best processing technique to on whatever the best processing technique for the object based on the status of it, and then it will try to bring the object online. So that is process default. It can go for process update or it can go for process full, but it picks the right processing technique based on the status of the object. When I say status of the object, for example, if you see the status of this particular object is processed, That is why when you go for process, it is showing process update. The best one for already processed object or already processed dimension is process update. Similarly, if I add a new dimension, let me add real quick, and let's say employee, let's say only 2 columns I selected. I select employee 1. So this is a new dimension. The status of this dimension is not processed. So when I try to click, when I try to select process, the best one for the status, for the status by the status of this particular dimension is process full. So if you select process default, it goes and find the status of each and every object that you're processing, and it will apply the best processing option that suits for the status of the particular object. So process default will take care of everything. If you select process default, if you don't know which one to select, if you go for process default, it will go and pick every object and get the status of it and applies the best one what suits for that. See, only one dimension was processed because all the remaining dimensions were already processed. So that is why process default always goes with the best suitable one for the state of your cube or database project. Now if you see here, it processed only one dimension and it read the data for this measure group, and that's it. It's all set. So that is what process default is. It picks the object and it determines the state, and then it applies the right processing option that suits for the object status. Now in the other case, if you select process full, it will go and clear all the data and start from the scratch. So the first step what it will do when you select process full is it will clear every object and then it will rebuild it. For example, we know we have that data folder where the data folder is. Let me go to the data folder, SQL, AS, OLAP, and data folder, and this is our cube. Now if you see, these are the different objects we have, and if I select process full, and all the old data will be deleted and the new data will be created. So all the whatever it has been processed before will be deleted. Now it's process completed, so everything is newly created. Okay, and if you see the time is like just now whenever I triggered it, 8:18 or whatever. So process full always clears everything and start from scratch. If you want me to draw it, so let's say this is your data warehouse and this is your cube, and this has 2 or 3 dimensions and 2 cubes. Okay, and when you select process default, if this is processed, this is processed, and this is processed, this is not processed, this is not processed, then only this object will be processed if you select process default, which means the data will be read only for this object. Okay, if you select process full, it will delete this, it will delete this, it will delete this, and it will start reading from scratch and fill everything again. So process full is like recreating the whole database. Like for example, if you see here, let me take out the drawing and let me quickly do a process full again. Still reading the data. You see the files are changing, whatever the files that are key that are changing, main that which stores the data. So it created at 8:18. So this is how the process full will clean. But remember, process full is also a faster option. It's not as bad as few other techniques, but process full is the good one. If I mean, you can go with the process full option when your database is small and the whole processing of the cube takes less than like 1 hour or 2 hours. But if the whole processing of the cube is gonna take let's say 12 hours, you cannot go for process full every day. You have to find different processing technique in that case. We will discuss about that. Now the third one is process clear. The name itself, it says that process clear will clear everything. If you go to this folder, it clears everything and nothing will be kept here. Like for example, you see the dimension is gone, completely gone. And if you go back to one folder back, and if you go to employee dimension, it's empty. Similarly, it clears everything, and even the cube. And if you go to the sales data, and you will not have anything in your partitions. So everything will be clear. Process clear will clear everything. Okay. When you do process clear, and if you select the process option, what is the best one for the status of your database now? The best one is nothing but process full. So it default selects process full. So the database is in unprocessed state. So it selects the process full. So analysis service is smart enough to pick the right one and show the right one for you based on the status of your database object. Okay. Now let's see the different processing options that we have at on dimension object. So let's see let's discuss the same one first. Let's discuss the process clear on the dimension. So process clear on the dimension is same as is same as the process clear on any other object. It clears the data. Like for example, if you see here, the default one is process update, right? Let me clear it. I'm clearing the dimension customer. So if I go back here, where is that? So customer, you see nothing. And if you go to the another dimension, you see data. And if you go to another dimension, you see data. And if you go to the last dimension, you see data because I have not cleared the particular dimension objects. Now, if you go to the cube, and if you go to the employee, and if you go to the employee partition, you have very little fact data. And if you go to the sales dimension, and if you go to any partition, it clears all the data. You know what is the reason why it cleared all the partition data, though I have not cleared the partition? So the reason is this particular dimension is having a link to that particular fact data, particular partition information. Like if I open the cube, remember the dimension customer, and if you go to cube structure, and this is our sales data part measure group, and if I go to the dimension usage, this sales data is having relationship to the customer dimension, which I have unprocessed or which I have processed using the process clear option. So if I clear any one of these, then it will go for a toss. The data will be cleared in the partition, in the measure group. The reason is this is one of the dimension table. You mentioned that there is a relationship to the sales data and you are clearing this data. There will be no data in this. So if you don't have data in your dimension table and if you have data in sales table, that means it fails the referential integrity. Without a parent, you are having child data. That doesn't make sense. So that is why whenever you unprocess any of the dimensions that has relationship to any of the fact data, then it will delete the data. It will delete the fact data too. Remember, you have to be very careful while dealing with the dimensions, assuming that you are processing only the dimension, you are clearing and you are doing process full on the dimension. Remember, it's gonna clear your measure group. This is the biggest disadvantage. Let's say your cube takes, your sales data takes 12 hours to process, and if your dimension takes 2 seconds to process. But if you clear this, the whole data will be cleared. And for everything to reprocess, you have to spend 12 hours. Okay. So before processing any dimension, make sure that it is fine. Make sure you are applied the right processing option. We'll see what is right processing option. Now, when I try to process it back, can I dock this somewhere? I think I better dock it here. Okay, cool. Now, if you see, the default option is selected as processful because there is no data and the first time you have to do processful. So the first time when the dimension or any object is in unprocessed state, then the first option you have to go for is processful. and you don't see the other options like process update or process indexes, something like that. You see different options when the object is already processed. For example, if you see here for the employee, you see different options because this object is already in process state. When it is already in process state, you'll get more options. We'll see why. So now this is the first time the option that I can go with is process full, which is like which is the same way what we discussed in database level. It will read all the data. It will clear if there is any, and it will read all the data. So if I select one, the folder, remember the fact will not be read. Fact deleted, once deleted, that's deleted, that's it. Fact will not be read. We're processing only customer dimension, and you can see some data in the customer dimension. So the processing is completed. Now, when I close this and when I select process again, you see the default option. It selects a different default option. It is process update now. Once the process, once the dimension in particularly is processed, the best option to go with is process update. I'll tell you the reason. Before discussing about this process update, let me process the whole cube once so that I'll get my cube data back. Now the cube data is erased because I unprocessed the dimension customer and sales partition, and my cube data is gone. So let me quickly process the whole objects, all the objects in this one real quick. I just want to show you the advantages of process update. So it's all the objects are processing irrespective of the status of each object. And now you can see your data here. The data is read. Now, if I go to the customer, the default one is process update. Why? So the process update works differently compared to the process full. So when you select process full, this is your data warehouse and this is your queue. When you select process full here, first thing what it will do is it will delete the object here, and it will delete all the related objects. Like I mentioned that the partitions are deleted, right? So it will delete all the deleted objects. Then it will start to read the data only for this object. Let's say this is the dimension. It starts reading the data for this object, but these objects will not be processed. These objects will be in unprocessed state only until you go and process it manually. So this is the biggest disadvantage of doing process full. Once your cube is completely processed, if you process full any one of the dimension, then the cube will be erased. So you have to be very careful in using process full. Now on the other hand, the process update, let's say you processed your cube. This is your dimension and these are related cubes. And when you select process update, it will read each and every record and it will store this data here, and it will compare and it will update the differences. So this cube will not, this object will not be erased, or this object will not be cleared. It will just update the object. If any records are updated, it will update. If any records are newly inserted, it will insert those records. So it will have two copies. One is from source, one is from the cube analysis services. It will compare. It's like a merge statement in SQL, compare and update. If not available, insert, something like that. So it will do that, and none of its related objects will be erased. That is the advantage. That is the beautiful advantage of process update. Let's say you have a cube that takes 12 hours to process. This will be as is if you select process update on the dimension. That is why once the dimension is in process state, it will go for process update by default. It will get the deltas, it will update the data in the dimension, and it will not erase the dependent objects. Let's give it a try for that. So I'm doing process update on this particular dimension customer, and if I see the sales data here, it is making some changes, but it will maintain the data. It's not gonna erase the data. So the process update is completed and it maintains the data. It won't read any data here. It just create the indexes. It won't read the data from scratch. It will just recreate the indexes, because if new data comes into your dimension, or if the existing data is updated, the indexes has to be updated, the aggregations has to be updated. It will work on only indexes and aggregations part, but it won't read the partition data again. So that is the best advantage. It's gonna save a lot of time. And keep in mind, if your cube is in production and if you are forced to process a dimension to get the latest data from your dimension, then go for process update blindly. Don't go for process full, which will erase your cube. And let's see the next option. Process default. It will take the object condition and it will try to apply the best. Now let's try to see what will happen to your sales data, the fact data, when you do process full. It's saying the dimension is already processed and nothing is required. So it won't get the updates. It won't do anything with the source data. It just check the status of the dimension. It's good. Okay, don't do anything. So the right one for your cube is, the dimension is process update. And process full, you know very well. Process clear, you know. Process data and process index. The process data and process index are like process full. So what is the difference is, if you do process full, the first step is read the data. Second step is create indexes. So instead of having it in one step, people sometimes they go for process data first and then create process indexes in the background. So the processing indexes sometimes it takes a lot of time. To avoid any delays, what people will do is they'll just read the data by using this process data option. They'll just read the data, and once it is read, they'll go for process indexes of all the objects at once, so that the other guys can continue querying that cube. So this is the difference between process index, process data, process index, and process full. So in short, process full is equal to process data and process index. Okay, so these are the different processing options that we have in in the dimension object level. There is one more processing object. Actually, it's not listed here. So you don't see that option. There is an option called process add. How to do process add on the dimension? So to do the process add on the dimension, you have to write some XMLA queries. XMLA stands for XML for analysis services. So let's see how to process the dimension using process add. So let me quickly go to my SSMS and connect to the cube. And let's say I want to process customer dimension. And right click, process. And even here, it won't show the process add option. But instead, what you can do is you can take the process update, okay, and you can script it out. Script action to a file or script action to a new query window. So once it is created, this is the XML script. You don't need to write it on your own. So what you need to do is, instead of process update, you just need to do process add. So what it will do is it will go and read only the data that has been added. It won't get the updates. It will read only the data that is newly added to the dimension. So these are the different processing options we have at the dimension level. Okay, we discussed about the dimension level options. Now let's go to the cubes. So if you go to the cubes, you'll see almost the same options, if I'm not wrong. Let me go here, maybe one or two new options. Let's quickly check that. So under cube, you have process default, which means it will go and pick the right processing option for each object that is dependent on this cube. And process full, which means it will delete everything and recreate from scratch. It will delete all the objects that are dependent on this, and then it will recreate it. And process data is is same as process data in your dimensions. It will read only the data for your fact tables. And process index will create the indexes. And process clear will clear the whole cube, just like what we discussed in process clear of the database at database level. The two new things, only one new thing, process add is same as process add over there. Okay, but if I'm not wrong, I can't, how can I see? Okay, here you can configure it for the fact data. Okay, that's the only difference. And process structure is the new thing. So process structure is very useful one when you are debugging or when you are fixing something. Let's say, for example, user complained that the data is not coming correctly for the year 2016. Okay, and if you go and see the partitions, let's say 2015 data is not clear. User raised a concern. Okay, the data is not good. There are some issues. There are some missing records in 2016. So in that case, how will you test it? What the first step? What you will do is you will go and try to fix the issue. Once the issue is fixed, you will try to test that. So to test that, what you need to do is you need to process the whole cube to see the data. All right. See, if you process only one partition, and if you try to see the data, it won't work. For example, I'm clearing this database now using the option process clear. So I'm clearing the cube, which means I cannot browse the cube. Okay. And let's say I fix the issue. And this is the partition I fixed. If I process only this partition, I'm doing process full on this partition, what will happen? The data will be read for this particular partition. And you can see 71,898 records has been read. And if I try to query it, you see no cubes are available because the other partitions are not processed. So to bring a cube available or online to the users, you need to make sure that all the partitions are processed. This is really painful when the whole process of the cube, let's say the whole process of these four partitions in this case takes 10 hours. Let's say you have used data, and if it takes 10 hours, then to test the issue that you have fixed on this on a particular partition, you need to process all the stuff, which will take 10 hours, and it's a waste of time, right? So to in such scenarios, what you can use, what you can do is you can make use of the process structure option. So process structure option is available at cube level. So here in this case, if you see the cubes, the cube name is wide world importers DW. And if you do process structure on it, what it will do is it won't read the data. It will just mark this has processed, yes, this has processed, yes, this has processed, yes. So it will mark everything as is. Let me show you an example. Actually, it's hiding the actual state, and it's gonna mark all the partitions as processed. So let's say, for example, if I go to process, and if I select process structure on the cube, and if I select OK, it will look for all the dimensions that are dependent on this cube. And if everything is good, then if you see here, this is the dimension. And if you see, there is no SQL query sent. Not even a single query. No record has been read. It just marks the partitions as processed. So in that case, if you try to browse it, you will be able to browse it. Oh, sorry. You will be able to browse the cube, but you will not have any data because it has not read any data. If you see, the profit is null, it has nothing to show. And if you drag the derived name, for example, it will show 0 records because the data is not read. It just bring the cube available, that's it. Now you can go and process only the partition that you want. So the whole cube is available, and you're processing only one partition, and it read 71,898 records. And now if you try to reconnect, and if you execute it, it gives you the data of that particular partition alone, which you can test. So out of 10 hours, hardly, let's say that particular partition takes 2 hours or 2.5 hours, you are going to save the remaining 7.5 hours if you are testing the fix that you have implemented on your cube data or cube partitions data. So that is the process structure. Process structure is rarely used, but if you're familiar with that, you will use it to test your data instead of processing the whole cube. You will process the relevant partition, and you will process the whole qubit process structure first, and then process only the relevant partition. So this is about processing options that we have. Now let's quickly see the processing option, process add, and you have to configure it. I've never tried that. And you can select the table. Select a measure group or the partition to update. Then specify whether the source of the updated query is a table or a query. So if you see the measure group, what measure group you want to update, this is the measure group and this is the partition. Let's say if I want to do process add, and then you can select what is the table that this guy and the data is available for this. So you have to specify that. In this data source view, if you select the table, let me type it. I think let me where is it? It's showing all the sys objects. I've never used this table option. First of all, I've never used this option, so I'm trying to find a way. Or you can go with the query. Select star from. Let's say in your database you are maintaining a flag called which is processed and which is not processed. Okay, and let's say there is a set of records which are not processed. Then you can call the table name where processed is equal to false. So in this case, it will go and read all the records for which the status is false. Only those records will be read and it will be added to this partition. And if you ask me, I prefer to go with SSIS for this processing because it's make the work easier than having this SQL query here. So the concept is it will give you an option to add the records. There are two problems with this. The first one is it won't work fine if your existing data is updated at source, like the scenario we discussed yesterday. If there are any updates to the previous data or historical data, it won't be helpful. And what is the other one for that? And you need to maintain these flags carefully. If you're not maintaining the flags, let's say if I execute the process add and it will read all the false stuff, then immediately whatever the record that has been read should be updated to true. Processed is equal to true. If you fail to do so, next time when you do process add, it will read the duplicate data. You have to be very careful while working on process add. So that is why SSIS is preferred to call the process add. The reason is you can do the process add in SSIS in one step, and the next step you can call an SQL statement to update all the records in that particular table and set the status of and set the process to flag to true. So that is why people prefer to go with SSIS. Maybe if time permits, I'll show you an example in SSIS. So here two options. One is you can select the table. Maybe you have to create a view in the database. I don't see anything here. Let me see why the hell it's not coming up. At least in the data source view, it should be. It's not showing anything. Data source or view, okay. And table schema or name, it's not showing anything. Shall I type anything? I think I can type it, but I don't want to get the name here. So this is about the different options you have. Any questions here? But we'll see process add if possible for in SSIS for the same partition. So if you go to the partition level processing, you will see the same options, but you won't see that process structure here. I guess it will be only at the cube level. Let me quickly show you the different options we have here. If you see process full, process add, and let's quickly try here process add. Why the table is not showing when I select the measure group. I think I have to type it. It's not showing anything. This is the data source and it shows all new reviews. Okay, we'll see that. So apart from that, it's the same options that you have. Process index, process clear, process structure, process data, and process pool, which we discussed. So if you have any questions, let me know about the processing techniques. This is very important, and the key thing that you have to keep in mind is you have to go for process update of the dimensions once the cube is moved to production or once the cube is online. Unless you make any structural changes to your dimensions, which will erase your cube completely. If you make any changes to the cube, then it will delete all the data. If you make any changes to your dimensions and save it to the server or deploy it to the server, it will delete all the data. So unless anything like that happened, you don't go with the process full of the dimensions. If you make any change, when I say when you make any changes, let's say in the dimension, all the dimensions are in process state now. If I take this customer and if I delete one of the attribute, let's say for example, I don't need buying group, or let's say WWI customer ID or derived name. If I delete this attribute, now when I try to process this, it will default go for processful because there are structural changes happen to your to your dimension, and you have to go for processful in this case. There is no way that you can go for process update. So when there are any structural changes you made and deployed to the server, then you have to go for processful, which will erase your cube. So be careful while making the changes to your dimension structure, and also while doing, which will force you, once you deploy that, you will not left with any other option apart from doing processful. So you have to be very careful with that. So that's it about the processing options in for today's session, and in tomorrow's session we will be looking at the properties, few key properties that we um, kept for that we did not discuss in the earlier session at the dimension level and at the attribute level, and the most important thing, creating the date dimension in the data source and creating a timetable on the server. We're going to see these two, and also generate a non-timetable in the data source. And once it is completed, we will be looking at the role-playing dimensions, and role-playing dimensions is the key thing which you need to know. And after that, we will be jumping into the calculations and perspectives and all the small stuff. That's it for today's session, guys. See you tomorrow, and good day.